May 18th. 1945, 23,000 feet above the clouds over Japan. The four Wright R-3350 engines of the B-29 Superfortress screamed against the thin air, each of the 18 cylinders burning hotter than they should, hotter than any crew wanted them to. Inside the pressurized cabin, 11 men felt the vibration change. A shudder, then another, then the fire warning light for engine number 3 blazed red. If you've made it this far, hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us which World War II story we should cover next. And don't forget to subscribe, because we're bringing you the untold stories that changed history. Now, let's continue. First Lieutenant Lawrence Stewart's hands moved to the mixture control before his mind fully registered what was happening. Years of training compressed into seconds. Mixture to cutoff, throttle retarded, fuel shutoff valve closed, cowl flaps closed, ignition off. His voice cut through the interphone to the pilot, Captain Rocky. "Number 3's gone, shutting her down." The pilot's response was immediate. "Feather it, Woody." But when the co-pilot hit the feathering button, nothing happened. The propeller blades refused to streamline. The engine continued to windmill, spinning uselessly in the slipstream, creating drag that would burn through their fuel reserves faster than a torch through paper. Stewart knew what this meant. Every B-29 flight engineer knew. The cylinder to which the feathering motor was attached had blown clean off, taking the motor with it, and that windmilling propeller was the least of their problems. The real danger was what came next. B-29 engines had a reputation. A dark one whispered about in ready rooms and painted in the logbooks of lost crews. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone was powerful, revolutionary, capable of producing 2,200 horsepower per engine. It was also temperamental, prone to overheating, and built with magnesium components that burned like thermite when deprived of oil. Every crew knew the statistics. Out of 414 B-29s lost bombing Japan, 147 fell to enemy action, but 267 were destroyed by engine fires, mechanical failures, takeoff crashes, and operational losses. For every Superfortress shot down by the Japanese, nearly 2 were lost to the machine itself. Stewart lifted off from Tinian Island just after midnight, their B-29 loaded with a droppable fuel tank in the forward bomb bay and general-purpose bombs in the aft bay. The mission was straightforward on paper, a daylight raid against the Tachikawa Army Air Arsenal, 20 miles from Tokyo. 30 other combat crews attended the same briefing. They were told to expect clouds at 12,000 feet. They climbed through them and kept climbing, the formation spiraling upward through layers of vapor until they finally broke through at 23,000 feet. But the target area was socked in, invisible beneath a blanket of white. The flight commander's voice crackled over the radio. "Bomb your secondary targets." That's when engine number 3 quit. The United States had poured $3 billion into the B-29 program, more than the cost of the atomic bomb itself, more than any single weapon system in history up to that point. The result was a flying machine of staggering capability, 141,000 pounds at maximum weight, wingspan of 141 feet, 4 engines, each a complex arrangement of 18 cylinders in 2 rows, supercharged, fuel injected, designed to push this aluminum giant to altitudes where the air was too thin for Japanese fighters to follow. Range of nearly 6,000 miles, bomb load of 20,000 pounds, pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets. It was the most advanced bomber in the world, a technological marvel that represented everything American industry could achieve when pushed to the limits of engineering. But it was also unfinished, rushed into combat before the bugs were worked out. The engines overheated, fuel systems leaked, exhaust manifolds cracked under stress, spitting white-hot flames onto magnesium engine casings. In the tropical heat of Saipan and Tinian, B-29 sat on runways where the concrete radiated heat like an oven, and crews only had minutes to get airborne before temperatures inside the engines climbed into the danger zone. General Curtis LeMay, who would later command the firebombing campaign that destroyed Japanese cities, had witnessed 5 B-29s crash in 2 days after arriving at the 20th Bomber Command in India. Engine failures in the desert heat. He knew the B-29's fatal flaw before most crews ever climbed aboard. Stewart watched the oil pressure gauge for engine number 3. As long as oil circulated through that windmilling engine, they had a chance. Without oil, friction would generate heat. Heat would ignite the magnesium, and once a B-29 engine caught fire, The clock started ticking. Tests had shown that a sustained engine fire burned through the engine mounts in minutes, then set the wing spar ablaze. When the spar burned through, the wing separated from the fuselage. After that, no one got out. Captain Rocky increased power on the 3 remaining engines. The B-29 shook, a deep vibration that rattled instruments and rattled nerves. They had dropped their bombs on the secondary target using radar, the returns fuzzy through the clouds, and now they were heading home, descending gradually to conserve fuel and reduce strain on the engines. Stewart consulted his 3-engine configuration chart and called out the minimum airspeed. They were 1,500 miles from Tinian, over hostile ocean, with 1 engine dead and 3 engines screaming. James Brooks, the central fire control gunner, sitting in for their regular left gunner, Stanley Makiewicz, keyed his interphone. "Oil, streaming off the right wing. A lot of it." Stewart felt his stomach tighten. "Keep watching it. Let me know if it changes." "Roger." The math was simple, but unforgiving. Each of the 3 operating engines was now burning fuel at a higher rate to compensate for the lost thrust from engine number 3. The windmilling propeller created additional drag, which required even more power to overcome. Stewart ran the calculations in his head, comparing current fuel consumption against pre-planned estimates. They had it, barely, with an adequate reserve to reach Tinian, but only if nothing else went wrong.
The men who flew B-29s over Japan came from farms and factories, from small towns and big cities, from every corner of the United States. They were trained at bases in Kansas and Georgia, taught to operate the most complex machine the Army Air Forces had ever fielded. Each crew consisted of 11 men: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, radar operator, right gunner, left gunner, central fire control gunner, and tail gunner. They learned to trust each other because there was no alternative. At 30,000 feet over the Pacific, with Japanese fighters climbing to meet them and anti-aircraft shells bursting in black flowers of shrapnel, trust was the only thing that kept them alive. They expected danger from the enemy. They had trained for it, drilled on evasive maneuvers, practiced firing the remote-controlled turrets at towed targets over the Gulf of Mexico. What they didn't expect was that their own aircraft would become the enemy. But the statistics didn't lie. More B-29 crewmen died from mechanical failures than from Japanese bullets. Captain Rocky ordered the radio operator, David Evans, to tune the radio to the Iwo Jima ground control frequency. Iwo Jima, that volcanic rock halfway between Tinian and Japan, captured at terrible cost by the Marines just 2 months earlier. It had become a lifeline for crippled B-29s, a place to land when engines failed or battle damage made the long flight home impossible. The island had already saved hundreds of lives. It might save theirs. They were approximately 100 to 150 miles from Iwo Jima when the airplane began to shake. Not the steady vibration they had felt since engine number 3 quit, but a violent convulsion that sent instruments spinning and made it impossible to read the gauges. The control yoke bucked in Rocky's hands. The nose dropped. The altimeter unwound. They were descending fast, and Stewart watched in horror as the fire warning light for engine number 3 flashed on. The engine compartment was burning. Stewart's hands moved without conscious thought. Open the cowl flaps to vent heat. Turn the fire extinguisher selector to engine number 3. Pull the handle. A stream of foam shot into the nacelle. The fire warning light went dark. He exhaled, realized he'd been holding his breath. Keyed the interphone. Engine fire. Extinguished. 1 bottle used. Copy, Rocky said, his voice tight. The airplane continued to shake. The descent continued. Then the fire warning light blazed red again. Stewart turned the backup fire extinguisher bottle to the malfunctioning engine and pulled the handle. The light went out, but he knew what this meant. They had used both bottles. If the fire started again, there was nothing they could do. No more foam, no more options. The engine would burn, the wing would burn, and 11 men would die screaming as the B-29 came apart in the sky. The violent shaking made most of the flight instruments inoperative. The airspeed indicator bounced wildly. The artificial horizon tumbled. The altimeter was the only gauge still readable, and it showed them dropping through 15,000 feet with no sign of leveling off. Rocky had the throttles firewalled on the 3 remaining engines, but it wasn't enough. They were losing altitude at an alarming rate, sinking toward the Pacific like a stone wrapped in aluminum. Rocky's voice cut through the interphone, calm but edged with urgency. "David, "Contact Iwo Jima. Tell them we're ditching." Ditching. The word hung in the pressurized cabin like a verdict. Ditching was the preferred procedure for abandoning a damaged B-29 because it kept the crew together, concentrated in one location for rescue. But ditching was also dangerous. The statistics were grim. When a B-29 hit the water, the impact could break the fuselage apart. Crew members could be trapped inside as the plane sank. Those who escaped often found themselves in the ocean with only their Mae West life preservers, waiting for rescue that might take hours or days. Some were never found. But there was another option: bailout. Jumping from the aircraft with a parachute, trusting that the silk would blossom and lower you gently to the sea. In theory, it was safer than ditching. In practice, it scattered the crew across miles of ocean. A man alone in the Pacific, drifting in his Mae West, had a slim chance of rescue. The ocean was vast. The search aircraft were few, and even if a Navy PBY Catalina or a submarine spotted you, there was no guarantee they could reach you before you succumbed to exposure, dehydration, or the predators that cruised beneath the surface. Rocky gave the order: drop the bomb bay fuel tank. Bombardier Dennis Inkle actuated the emergency release system. The fuel tank fell away, tumbling toward the ocean below, but as it exited the bomb bay, it struck one of the doors. Metal screamed against metal. The door jammed, hanging open, creating a massive cavity in the belly of the aircraft that would fill with water the instant they hit the surface. Stewart understood immediately. With the bomb bay door jammed open, their chances of surviving a ditching had just dropped to nearly zero. The B-29 would break apart on impact. Even if it stayed together, water would flood the fuselage in seconds. The plane would sink like an anvil. Rocky's voice came through the interphone, steady as a metronome. Crew, stand by for bailout. Bailout procedure. The forward crew members would exit through the nose gear wheel well. The aft cabin crew would use the rear bomb bay. The radar operator would go out the rear entrance door. The tail gunner, isolated in his position at the back of the aircraft, would use his escape hatch. Rocky ordered the nose gear extended. It could be lowered independently of the main landing gear, creating an opening in the floor of the forward compartment. Stewart removed his headset and put on his helmet. He placed the headset on his clipboard, positioned on his knees. He pulled his glasses from his face and zipped them into the top pocket of his flight suit so he wouldn't lose them during the descent. In the bombardier compartment, Dennis Inkle and Archie removed the nose gear cover from the open wheel well. A powerful suction immediately developed, pulling at loose items. Archie's navigation maps were sucked out the hole, fluttering away into the sky like birds. Stewart leaned over to look down through the opening. His headset slid off the clipboard and dropped into the void. He watched it fall, spinning slowly, until it disappeared toward the ocean thousands of feet below.
And in that moment, watching his headset vanish, Stewart made a decision. He would not jump. He would stay with the aircraft. He would attempt to land the B-29 on the ocean after everyone else bailed out. The reasoning was simple. If he jumped, he would be alone in the Pacific. The crew would be strung out along the flight path for miles, each man drifting in his Mae West, separated by distance and current. The chance of linking up with anyone was remote, but if he could ditch the airplane and get into a life raft, his chances of survival and rescue were much greater. Each B-29 carried 2 large life rafts. They were equipped with emergency supplies, signal flares, food, water. A man in a life raft had a fighting chance. Stewart didn't know that Captain Rocky had made the same decision. The pilot also intended to stay with the airplane, to ditch it after the crew bailed out. 2 men independently chose to bet their lives on their ability to bring a crippled bomber down on the ocean in a controlled crash. But then Rocky's voice crackled over the interphone again. "Belay that bailout order. Rate of descent is slowing." Stewart glanced at his altimeter. It was true. The needle was still moving downward, but slower now. They had dropped through 5,000 feet, then 4,000, and now they were mushing along at approximately 3,000 feet, barely above the wave tops. The airspeed was well below the established stalling speed. The B-29 should have stalled out, should have flipped over and tumbled into the sea. But it hadn't. It flew on, shaking violently, the 3 remaining engines howling at full power, somehow generating just enough thrust to keep them airborne. Stewart considered it a miracle. There was no other word for it. The laws of physics should have sent them into the ocean minutes ago, but they were still flying. Barely. The airplane felt like it was balancing on a knife edge. one gust of wind, or one moment of inattention away from disaster. But it was flying. Rocky's orders came quickly. Woody, raise the nose gear. David, re-establish contact with Iwo Jima. We need a heading. When the radio operator contacted Iwo Jima ground control, he was surprised by their request. Sing into your microphone, they told him. Woody erupted. We're in an extreme emergency, barely maintaining altitude, instruments out of commission, not sure of our location, airplane shaking like it's going to break apart any second, and you want me to sing? But the controller explained. The violent shaking of the B-29 was breaking up Woody's words, making it impossible to establish a clear radio direction fix. If he hummed or sang, the continuous tone would give them something to lock onto. Woody hummed. The ground station obtained a fix and provided a heading to the island. Woody monitored the instruments of the 3 operating engines. Cylinder head temperatures were in the red. Oil pressure was fluctuating, but they were still running. He prayed they would continue. According to the fuel gauges, they had just enough to make Iwo Jima. Just enough. No margin for error. The B-29 Superfortress was designed to be sturdy. The airframe was built to withstand stresses that would tear apart lesser aircraft. But it was never designed for this. Flying at full power on 3 engines, with a 4th windmilling, creating drag at an altitude where the air was too thick and the engines too hot, with a jammed bomb bay door and instruments that barely functioned. The airplane was beyond its limits, operating in a regime that no test pilot had ever explored. Stewart wasn't worried about the airplane shaking apart. He trusted the engineers at Boeing. They had built a strong machine. But the shaking was distressing, a constant reminder that they were one malfunction away from catastrophe. And the engines terrified him. Each one was a bomb waiting to detonate, a complex arrangement of pistons and valves and fuel lines and oil passages, all operating at temperatures and pressures that pushed the materials to their breaking point. The Japanese had expected American bombers. They had prepared defenses, built fighter aircraft, trained pilots, installed anti-aircraft batteries around every major city. But they had not expected the B-29. When the first Superfortresses appeared over Tokyo in November 1944, Japanese civilians looked up in shock. The bombers flew so high they were barely visible. Silver specks trailing contrails across the sky. The anti-aircraft shells burst thousands of feet below them. The fighters struggled to reach them, and the bombs fell, high explosive and incendiary, turning wooden cities into infernos. The Japanese had never experienced strategic bombing on this scale. The Doolittle raid in April 1942 had been a psychological blow. 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers launched from an aircraft carrier to strike Tokyo and other cities. But the damage had been minimal, more propaganda than destruction. The B-29 campaign was different. It was systematic, relentless. City after city reduced to ash. By the time Stewart's crew took off for the mission to Tachikawa, the air war over Japan had already killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and left millions homeless. But the cost to the Americans was also high. Not just the bombers lost to enemy action, but the bombers lost to mechanical failure. The bombers that crashed on takeoff, overloaded with fuel and bombs, engines overheating in the tropical sun. The bombers that made it to Japan only to have engines quit over the target, forcing crews to choose between ditching in the ocean or bailing out over enemy territory. The bombers that limped back to Tinian on 2 engines, or 1, and crashed on landing because they were too damaged to control. Every crew knew the risks. They were briefed on the statistics. They were told about the search and rescue procedures, the submarines positioned along the flight routes, the PBY Catalinas that patrolled the ocean looking for downed airmen. But statistics and procedures were cold comfort when you were sitting in a crippled airplane at 3,000 feet, engines screaming, fuel gauges dropping, and the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. After what felt like an eternity, someone spotted land. Iwo Jima, that barren volcanic island that had been bought with the blood of 6,800 Marines killed in action, and another 20,000 wounded. But to the crew of this B-29, it was the most beautiful sight they had ever seen. Rocky requested a straight-in approach.
No time for patterns or procedure. They needed to get this airplane on the ground immediately. Stewart hurriedly completed his pre-landing checks. Woody extended the landing gear. The hydraulics groaned. The gear locked down with 3 green lights. Flaps extended. The B-29 shook even more violently as the additional surfaces disrupted the airflow. Rocky kept the speed high to prevent a stall. The runway appeared ahead, carved into the volcanic rock, still scarred from the battle that had raged across this island 2 months earlier. The landing was fast, too fast, but Rocky had no choice. If he slowed down, the airplane would drop out of the sky. The wheels hit hard, bounced once, hit again, tires squealed, brakes applied. The B-29 decelerated, finally slowing to a controllable speed. Rocky steered off the active runway and taxied to the parking area where other war-weary and battle-damaged Superfortresses sat in various states of repair. Stewart shut down the engines. The sudden silence was almost painful after hours of noise. The crew sat for a moment. No one speaking, each man processing what had just happened. They were alive, against all odds, against logic and physics and the malevolent temperament of the Wright R-3350 engine. They were alive. They deplaned. The substitute gunner, James Brooks, knelt down and kissed the ground. His hands were shaking. He told Stewart that when he returned to Tinian, he would request grounding. He was done flying combat missions. Brooks had been unlucky before. On an earlier mission, his bomber had crashed into the ocean shortly after takeoff from North Field. He survived, but many of his crewmates were killed. This near disaster was the final straw. He was convinced that bad luck followed him, that his number was up every time he climbed into a B-29. After unloading their equipment, they buttoned up the airplane and departed for the flight operations area in a military truck. It was late afternoon, too late to fly back to Tinian. They were informed they would get a patched-up B-29 for the return flight the next morning. They were given a ride to the mess tent for a meal, then to the bivouac area, some distance from the flight line. The tents they were assigned to were battered, full of tears, rips, and holes. Most of the other tents in the area were empty. When they asked why, the driver explained, near the end of the battle for Iwo Jima, a large number of Japanese soldiers had emerged from caves and launched a bonsai attack at night. They swept through army outfits and a fighter unit, slashing tents, killing and wounding sleeping soldiers and airmen. The attack continued into the hospital area before it was finally stopped. What a place to spend the night. Stewart laid down on his cot, fully clothed, and placed his loaded pistol under his pillow. He tried to sleep, but dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every sound, half expecting a Japanese soldier to burst through the tent flap. He was glad when dawn arrived. Later, he learned that several fellow officers had also slept with their pistols nearby. A military truck transported them to the mess hall for breakfast, then to the flight line. They were assigned a weary-looking, patched-up B-29 for the return flight. The pilots and Stewart carefully examined the exterior for damage that might indicate an unsafe airplane. It looked okay. They accepted it. Stewart started the engines and performed the magneto checks. Everything checked out. They taxied to the active runway. During the takeoff roll, Stewart closely watched the engine instruments for any signs of malfunction. The engines operated normally at full power. They lifted off and headed for Tinian. The flight was uneventful. They landed around noon and checked in for a belated debriefing. Combat mission number 19, their roughest mission to date. Stewart fervently hoped that their remaining missions would be better. Later that day, Rocky was summoned to group headquarters, where he was given a reprimand. Word of their intended ditching had been received by group personnel. They had contacted the search and rescue unit headquarters and informed them of Rocky's plan, but word of Rocky's decision to fly to Iwo Jima instead of ditching had not been received. When Rocky explained what happened, they were satisfied. The crew learned that a B-29 participating in the Tachikawa raid had crashed into the ocean 20 minutes after takeoff from North Field. The aircraft commander and 4 crew members were missing. The remaining crew members had been rescued. Altogether, 272 B-29s had participated in the attack. 4 bombers had been lost. Stewart's crew had nearly become the 5th. The next day, Stewart went to the flight surgeon's office to see about intermittent stomach pains he had been experiencing. The flight surgeon asked how many combat missions he had flown. When Stewart said 19, the surgeon told him the pain was connected to those missions. Stress, fear, the accumulated weight of flying into the teeth of Japanese defenses, of trusting your life to engines that could burst into flames without warning, of knowing that every mission might be your last. The surgeon gave Stewart charcoal pills to relieve the gas pains, It was all he could do. The symbolism of Stewart's headset falling through the nose gear opening was not lost on him. That headset was his link to the crew, the device through which he communicated, coordinated, kept everyone alive. Watching it fall into the void was like watching his connection to survival disappear. But he chose to stay anyway. He chose to trust himself, his training, and his aircraft, even when that aircraft was trying to kill him. The B-29 represented American industrial might. It was a machine built by a nation that could afford to spend $3 billion on a single weapons system, a nation with the factories and the resources and the engineers to create something unprecedented. But it also represented the cost of that ambition, the cost in rushed development, in untested systems pushed into combat before they were ready, the cost in young men who climbed into those aircraft knowing the odds, knowing that the machine itself might betray them.
Every B-29 crew carried 2 food warmers, one forward and one aft, electrical devices that heated pre-packaged meals. It was a small luxury, a reminder of home in the middle of a 14-hour mission over hostile territory. Hot food, coffee, small comforts that made the difference between endurance and collapse. But those food warmers were also a symbol of the disparity between American forces and their Japanese counterparts. Japanese pilots flew an aircraft with minimal instrumentation, no heating, no pressurization. They wore heavy flight suits and oxygen masks that froze in the thin air at high altitude. American crews flew in pressurized comfort, heated cabins with food and water and survival equipment. This abundance extended to everything: replacement aircraft, spare parts, fuel. The Japanese fought with what they had, constantly short of resources, improvising, stretching every gallon of fuel and every bullet. The Americans fought with an industrial base that produced B-29s faster than they could be lost, that delivered supplies and equipment in quantities the Japanese could not imagine. But all that abundance meant nothing when your engines caught fire at 23,000 feet over Japan. It meant nothing when you were sinking toward the ocean with jammed bomb bay doors and fire extinguisher bottles already spent. In those moments, survival came down to skill, luck, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Stewart and Rocky had all 3. The transformation that occurred in that crew was subtle but profound. They had entered the mission as professionals, trained and competent, but still operating within the bounds of normal expectations. They had exited as something different, men who had looked death in the face and refused to blink, men who had made decisions that defied protocol and logic, decisions based on instinct and courage. Stewart's choice to stay with the aircraft, Rocky's determination to keep flying when every regulation said to ditch or bail out, the crew's collective refusal to panic when the airplane shook so violently that instruments failed. This experience changed their perception of what was possible. They had been told that a B-29 could not fly at stalling speed. They had proven otherwise. They had been told that ditching was the safest option. They had chosen a different path and survived. They had learned that the line between life and death was thinner than anyone wanted to admit, and that sometimes survival required stepping over that line and gambling everything on a single decision. The epilogue of this story is not found in the mission reports or the after-action reviews filed by the group headquarters. It is found in the quiet moments after the mission, when Stewart lay in his cot on Iwo Jima with his pistol under his pillow, unable to sleep, listening to the wind whistle through the torn fabric of the tent. It is found in the hands of the substitute gunner who kissed the ground and decided he would never fly again. It is found in the stomach pains that sent Stewart to the flight surgeon, pains that no pill could truly cure because they were the physical manifestation of fear and stress and the knowledge that he would have to do this again. 18 more missions before he completed his tour. The larger truth this story illuminates is that war is not won by machines alone. The B-29 was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a collection of flaws and compromises, a system pushed beyond its design limits because the mission demanded it. The men who flew those aircraft were the ones who made the difference. They took machines that could kill them as easily as the enemy and forced those machines to perform. They climbed into cockpits knowing the statistics, knowing that 2 out of every 3 losses came from the aircraft itself,
itself, and they flew anyway. Freedom and democracy are abstractions until they are tested. The crew of this B-29 was not fighting for abstractions. They were fighting to stay alive, to bring their aircraft home, to complete the mission and survive another day. But in doing so, they embodied the principles that sent them into combat, the belief that some things are worth risking everything to defend, the conviction that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it, the understanding that survival sometimes requires betting everything on a single decision. The abundance represented by that B-29, by its pressurized cabin and its food warmers and its sophisticated systems, was a product of a society that valued innovation and production. But the true abundance was not material. It was moral. It was the willingness of men like Stuart and Rocky and their crew to put themselves in harm's way, to trust each other, to make decisions that defied logic because the alternative was surrender. The Pacific Ocean stretched beneath that crippled B-29 for hundreds of miles, a vast expanse of water that could swallow an aircraft and leave no trace. But it did not swallow this one. This crew made it to Iwo Jima, landed safely, and flew home the next day. They went on to fly more missions, to face more danger, to accumulate more hours over Japan until the war finally ended. When the Japanese delegation stood on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, a formation of B-29 Superfortress flew overhead. Those bombers were a reminder of the destruction that had befallen Japan. The cities burned to ash, the industrial base shattered, but they were also a testament to the men who flew them. Men who risked their lives in machines that were as dangerous to their crews as they were to the enemy. The story of this B-29 crew is not unique. Hundreds of similar stories unfolded over the Pacific during the final year of the war. Crews struggling with engine failures, battle damage, fuel shortages, making life-or-death decisions in seconds with incomplete information and no guarantee of survival. Many of those crews did not make it home. They ditched in the ocean and drowned. They bailed out and were never found. They burned when their engines caught fire and the wings collapsed. But some made it. They landed on Iwo Jima, or Tinian, or Saipan, with engines smoking and fuel tanks empty, having extracted every ounce of performance from machines that should have failed hours earlier. They survived because they refused to accept defeat, because they trusted their training and their judgment, because they had the courage to stay with the aircraft when protocol said to abandon it. That courage, that refusal to surrender, that determination to survive against impossible odds is what won the war. Not the B-29 itself, but the men who flew it. Not the $3 billion spent on development, but the thousands of individual decisions made in cockpits and crew compartments by men who chose to fight when fighting seemed futile. The headset that Stuart watched fall through the nose gear opening was eventually replaced. He flew the rest of his missions with a new one. But he never forgot the moment when he watched it disappear, the moment when he decided to stay with the aircraft, the moment when he chose to trust himself over procedure. That moment defined the rest of his life. It taught him that survival is not guaranteed, that courage is a choice, and that sometimes the only way forward is to keep flying when every instinct says to jump. This is the truth that emerges from the story of this B-29 crew. War is ultimately about individuals making choices under pressure. The machines matter, the resources matter, the strategy and tactics matter. But in the end, it comes down to men in cockpits, hands on controls, making decisions that determine whether they live or die. And sometimes, those decisions defy everything they have been taught, everything they have been told, because the situation demands something more than protocol. It demands courage. The abundance that America brought to the Pacific War was not just material. It was human. It was the abundance of men willing to fly these missions, to risk their lives, to trust in machines that were still learning how to be reliable. That abundance of courage, of determination, of refusal to quit was what made the difference. The B-29 was the tool, but the men were the weapon. And in the end, they proved unstoppable.